folks. Welcome to another edition of the Omnist Hour. As I crank the tunes down just a bit so I can talk over it. Topic of today is spiritual energy. What it is, how to use it through prayer and communion. So tune in if that sounds interesting. Okay, first off, let's start off with some definitions. Again, this is according to the Omnist, who tries to condense the truth from all belief systems into a system that makes sense of all the available data, including scientific data. Okay, so what is spiritual energy? It is a form of energy that operates in the spirit world, the spiritual dimension. It can extend to the physical dimension, and one of the ways that it does that is the way that we've mentioned before. How do souls get born? That's an exertion of spiritual energy that creates a particle-antiparticle pair in the physical universe that are inhabited by new souls. And what happens to those souls after that is their first incarnation, their first chance to make some decisions. Okay. Now, obviously, there are a lot of spiritual traditions, and they all have some concept of how spiritual energy works and what it is. Let me tell you that it is wave-like in its properties, in that, like electromagnetic energy, it has frequency, it has amplitude, and it has a shift, a starting point, what the zero crossing point is in relation to other waves. Okay, so this is quite a bit more complicated than many New Agers would have you believe when they talk about good vibrations or high vibrations. They have a very, very simplistic idea of this. There's certain truths in it, but they miss a lot of the nuances of what spiritual frequency is all about. Okay, so essentially, these three properties describe a soul's spiritual state in any given moment. Okay, so if I get up one day and I'm in a really bad mood, I'm feeling kind of down, I might emanate what some people would call a low spiritual frequency. There's nothing wrong with that, and it's perfectly normal to have those days. And in fact, all souls have an inherent high frequency that they operate within, and an inherent low frequency. And that sort of defines the range of other souls that they can interact with, for better or worse. And souls in different vessels at different stages in their journey will have different high maximums and minimums. Okay, and in terms of souls interacting with each other, their energies can be resonant, which means that they're roughly the same the same frequency and in the same phase. So they're coherent with each other and they amplify each other. And in the spiritual world, that amplification is not just, if you have two sine waves and you overlay them in the same period, the same phase, you get double the wave, or two sine waves of the same amplitude. In the spiritual world, you actually get a magnifying effect. So it's not just a doubling; it's an exponential as you add more souls that are resonant to the same frequency, that are feeling the same vibe, this is how you generate enough spiritual energy to do magic, to move things spiritually, telepathically, to communicate telepathically, to move things telekinetically, excuse me, that's the word. And depending on the amplitude, a single soul may have enough spiritual energy at a certain frequency, and that's not your amplitude is not always the same. It's sort of a function of your experience. As you learn to use a certain frequency, you get better at generating more energy at that frequency. And that's another of the reasons why we reincarnate, so that we develop these resonances, these tuning points that are kind of the signature of our soul to the multiverse. Guide us to where we might fit in best. Okay, so if you have two souls that are operating at basically the same frequency, but are completely out of alignment with each other in terms of phase, like a 180-degree phase shift, they tend to be what we call anti-resonant. They cancel each other out, and the feeling of that canceling is a very unpleasant thing. This is what's happening when you deal with somebody that you think is giving you bad vibes. More often than not, you're giving them bad vibes too. And those bad vibes can magnify themselves too. So if you're completely out of sync at the same frequency, it'll just cancel out, and you'll just be like, that person does nothing for me, right? I just can't relate to him at all. If your shifted phase is varying, sometimes you feel in sync, sometimes you feel out of sync. You can have one of these challenging relationships where sometimes you're just shooting the moon with good feelings, and other times you're in the pits of hell. And I'm sure we all know friends, or even closer souls, that have that sort of a relationship with you. Okay, so I'm not going to go into much more on spiritual frequencies in this segment. You can look forward to a future segment where we talk about prophets and messiahs, and we'll talk a little bit more about how these frequencies fit into the system of grading, if you will, of this simulation that we come to live in and experience and learn. But for today, I want to just stay on the topic of these resonances. Before I go into that, though, I do want to mention the other key difference of spiritual energy versus electromagnetic energy. Again, it's a very different thing. It has similar properties, and you can use a lot of the same terminology. One of the things that doesn't apply, or at least doesn't apply uniformly, is electromagnetic energy, if you ever studied physics, has an amplitude effect between two bodies on the order of 1 over r, or r squared, 1 over r squared, so that the power of the energy dissipates very quickly with distance from whatever source is generating that energy. And that applies to gravity as well. So you've got great firsthand experience of gravity being greatest when you're close to the earth, right? If you go up thousands of feet in the air, you're going to feel lighter. And at some point, if you're far away enough from the Earth, you're going to feel like you're in a virtual vacuum. Gravity is going to be so weak. There's nothing particularly pulling you to one side of the space capsule or another. Similarly, if you have a cell phone, you know that the further you stray from a tower, the signal gets weaker very quickly. And even in fairly developed areas where towers are not spaced too far, you'll find that there are kind of dead zones between towers where if you don't have a really good antenna in your phone, you might drop service for a short time. Okay, that's the 1 over r squared effect. Spiritual energy works differently. And it's based upon relationships. So this is where the idea of connectedness comes from. That's real popular in many religions. Okay, you've heard people say we're all connected. Well, that's true. We're connected, but through a lineage of souls to the first soul. And the first soul, we talked about the first 3 souls. We didn't talk about how it proliferated from there, but there's uncountable souls in the multiverse. And, some happen to be generated from the thoughts of the first few souls, and some happen to be generated from the thoughts of souls thousands and millions of generations later. And depending on that hierarchy, that's this connection we're talking about. Okay? And one of the big changes that's coming around through this cosmic evolution that I've been talking about, this event, is how that connection system worked. I'm not sure if I mentioned it I think I mentioned it in another session, but I'll say it again. The old system of connection in the spiritual world was based upon a pyramidal grid. Okay, if you think of a 4-sided pyramid, you put another 4-sided pyramid directly on top of it, and then draw lines between the corners, you get a cube. And if you populate a space, if you will, an area with those cubes, you get a very, very rigid grid. And these points of the pyramids that make up this grid were the connecting points that you had to go through to get to other souls. Okay, so if the first soul, God, happened to be, say over here, well, it's kind of hard for me to point at things, but say up in the upper right corner there where the kind of peacock tail thing is. And, through the birth of souls and the expansion of the multiverse, you live down where the dragon is. Well, it wasn't easy for you to get to God. In fact, you probably almost never got a message through or talked to God, unless every single soul along a path leading to God got you there. And so it created a very rigid system of hierarchy where the special souls, the ones who had the most experience, the most knowledge, and therefore the most power and influence, were very hard to get to. And this kind of reflected the old system of how we dealt with gods. Each people had their own unique god. Look back, 6,000-7,000 years ago and earlier, at the records of religion, how the multiverse worked in those days, and they will all tell you there was a time where each city-state, each tribe had their own god who looked after them and protected them. And that was how this rigid system of religion worked. at some point, when the laws started changing and the new system started percolating through the multiverse, all of a sudden, those connections didn't work the same way anymore. And the new system of connections is based upon, as I mentioned, a superfluid Merkaba. A Merkaba is basically two tetrahedrons, which is kind of like a pyramid, but with only three sides, so you can't build them into any kind of a rigid structure. Two tetrahedrons intertwine so that it has, let's see, eight points of contact instead of the old system where if you were at a particular juncture as a soul, you did still have 8 points of contact. It's consistent. You still have 8 points of contact, but those contacts are fluid and they don't bind in any one particular way. Now, what that means from a spiritual connection standpoint is that we can alter the contact paths without getting permission necessarily from everybody in the contact path. It's almost like how a neural network would work, how the internet works to connect one place to another. You don't necessarily have to have permission to send a packet through any particular node, unless they're running some sort of sneaky sniffer software that intercepts packets and tries to block them or disassemble them. But even at that, as long as there's another route through the internet, you'll still get to your destination eventually. It just might take longer. And so this is how this alternate matrix, this new matrix that's coming into being, works in the spiritual world. And it leaves spirits much more free to build the contacts that feel comfortable to them. And that's very important for improving on this system that has reincarnation and karma, because if you know anything about how souls interact, we tend to develop affinities with the souls that we interact with. The biggest affinity might be with that very first soul that we were born with as a particle-antiparticle pair. That's a pretty special thing to share your first incarnation moment together. Other souls we encounter, and we happen to have relationships in particular lives that had really strong meaning to us, and they will leave an indelible impression of the resonances that we found with them, and anti-resonances too, how we interacted in a spiritual sense. The things that felt good are going to be some of the deepest memories that you have, sometimes even transcending the forgetfulness of rebirth. And in the old system, if you wanted to encounter those souls again, you had to work through all the other souls, or the other souls that were the rigid paths to that other soul, to be able to work with them and deal with them spiritually. And that was a detriment. That was harmful. It was causing too much delay for spiritual activity to take place. And if spiritual activity is delayed, then development in the physical world is delayed. This was thought to be a good idea at the time because they were still experimenting with this physical matrix, this physical training system, and they didn't want it to evolve too quickly. And they wanted the very powerful souls at that time wanted to make sure that they didn't lose any of the influence and control they had. This is a big change, because it means basically that new souls can evolve faster and old souls have less influence over that process. Instead of having their influence somewhat defined by where they fit in this spiritual grid, now their influence needs to be purely based upon experience with them. And that's really only fair. That sort of takes away the home team advantage God and the older souls that were created before we had this training system had over all you young souls having to deal with reincarnation and karma. So it's a great improvement to the fairness of the multiverse, but it does mean that the laws of prayer and communion are changing. The rituals that worked in old religions, the rules of thumb, the priestly arcane knowledge may not apply anymore. And so what I really want to tell you is that in this new system, things like prayer and communion are going to take a whole new meaning. Okay, so what is prayer fundamentally? It is a number of souls coming together in resonance to amplify their spiritual energy to accomplish a particular common goal, common task, influence the multiverse in some way, or some piece of the multiverse, some area of the multiverse, to change or influence events that are in the midst of happening. Okay, so it's possible through prayer to subvert the free will of other souls. It's bad karma. You're going to pay for it. You're going to have to atone for usurping their fundamental right of free will. But yes, it is possible to force souls, especially incarnated souls who are not so aware of what's really going on, to do your bidding. And this is where stories of demonic possession come from, of angelic influence. It doesn't necessarily have to be something negative. You know, an angel can stop you from committing suicide. Like the old story, you know, in It's a Wonderful Life. Didn't really stop him, but figured out a way. See, that was a smart angel, figured out a way to do it without directly controverting the will of the subject. That's how you do it, playing the good side. At any rate, so that's what prayer is all about, and ultimately communion, any kind of communion, is really a special kind of prayer. It's not a ritual. It's not something that's going to make you more holy, or you got to do every Sunday or every so often or on certain special holidays, contrary to what, you know, the Catholic Church is telling their people. Communion is basically an organized way of connecting souls. So a prayer, you can pray anytime, right? And if there are spiritual powers tuned in, resonating, they'll hear your prayer and they'll be able to act on it, for better or worse, depending on how they feel about you. If they have no relationship at all, it'd be like, so-and-so is praying for this and I heard it. Don't look at me, it's not my problem. Many prayers don't get answered for that reason. If prayer doesn't get answered, it's not because nobody cares. It's either because nobody's resonating that has enough power to do anything, or nobody cares. And the fact of them not caring doesn't make them bad spiritual entities, particularly if they've got a lot of power, because if you have a lot of power, you get a lot of prayers. And souls are souls. They have limitations. They can't answer every prayer. They can't, sit at their switchboard 24/7, fulfilling people's whims. Some try. Some try to do that for a while, and eventually they realize that they're not the God of their imaginations that's all powerful and all seeing and does everything, and they have to be humble enough to admit that, my sphere of influence, what I can really get involved in and make a difference in, needs to be more focused. That's another part of the learning path of a soul, is to be able to not only find what our passion is, where our place is in the spiritual world, but to really get focused in on, something we can really make a difference on, rather than just, I think I'll go over here and, be a star for a while, and then I'm going to go be a grain of sand for a while, and, there are souls that wander around from role to role because they still haven't figured out what they want to do, and that's perfectly okay. But most souls gravitate towards a certain kind of work based upon their experience. At any rate, so communion can be any sort of ceremony that allows you to find and connect with other spiritual energies. Now, the Catholic Rite Communion, when it's done right, can connect you with people who have that same belief. And certainly the people in the room that are sharing the same communion, being administered by the same clergy and so forth, can feel a resonance. And that resonance may be amplified by the spiritual energy of the cleric. So there's absolutely a basis for, all of the stories of miracles and healing and whatever that comes from the Catholic Church. That's not the only way to do it, though. There are spiritualists in the Andes and the Amazon, all over South America, who commune through plant medicines. Also very common in Africa. Used to be common around the world before monotheist religions decided that their communion was the only one that was legal. They were afraid of these other methods of communion that didn't necessarily need the administration of a cleric or an imam or a rabbi. And so, there's plant medicine. Actually, it's a combination of two plants called ayahuasca, which is one of the better ways to commune. And in this case, it is communing with the souls of the plants. And plant souls, as I've mentioned before, have a very different experience. They may not have so many choices to make personally, but they are keen observers of their surroundings and of the comings and goings of animals, including humans. So they have a lot of knowledge of our history, of our past, and they talk to each other. Plants are very sociable vehicles for souls. That's why some people gravitate towards incarnating as plants. It's a pretty easy life, and it's actually a very social life. There's not a lot to do but soak up nutrients and talk to the other plants, and occasionally talk to other soul vehicles through means of teas and herbs, extracts, whatever. And that's why there's so many different things you can do with plants. They have so many medicinal properties. Medicine is always connected to something spiritual. You can codify its effects scientifically and describe what it does on a molecular level, but until you acknowledge that the characteristics of plants, of animals, of any substance are a function of its spiritual lineage, its spiritual properties. You're never going to really completely understand the art of healing, or why some doctors are better than others, why some treatments work for some people and for other people they don't. Anyway, so communion can be a lot of different things. It's basically any organized ritualistic interaction between souls. A doctor treating a patient is a form of communion. Friends or relatives catching up on a holiday is a form of communion. That's why these things mean so much to us. And also why they can be sometimes fraught with negative feelings. Because the mere fact that we're related by DNA does not mean that we have any sort of resonance as souls. We might not even be operating in the same frequency range. I know I've got one sibling that I have almost no resonance with. We can't stand to be around each other for more than a day or so. And during that whole time we're together, both of us feel uncomfortable. We have no understanding of each other's life choices, the way the other ticks. It seems very foreign to us, and at least until I sort of got on my Omnist kick a few years ago, it was something that I had no understanding of. It was like, this guy must be from a different planet. And I'm sure he felt the same way about me. Anyway, so I think that kind of explains how prayer can work, how communion works, why prayer does or doesn't work. Let me say another thing about prayer that may help you understand it too. Religions themselves are souls. Religions are actually some of these new virtual souls that we've been creating to manifest this new scheme in the spiritual world, in the whole multiverse, spiritual, physical, all the dimensions. This new law is going to allow these virtual souls, these ideas, a consciousness, if you will, that has no body, which is kind of like, how souls are in the spiritual world in many respects, to exist in this physical world. So religions of themselves have their own frequency characteristics. And those characteristics change as the oversoul of those religions grows and learns. So when Christianity began, it had a very different set of beliefs, a very different vibe than it has right now. It's evolved. And the oversoul of souls of religions evolved to try to make those religions vital to the social and political situation that's going on around it. And when they cease to be vital to it, they cease to have believers. And when a religion has no believers, it's not needed anymore. And that's essentially like the death of that idea. It might still exist in a textbook or something, so maybe the oversoul of Zoroastrianism still exists and still is looking after its religion, even though it has no believers. It's got people that are aware of it, which is a sort of belief. You admit it existed, you know it existed, but that religion has very little influence at this point. And so these religious beliefs, and that's why some people will espouse a certain over others, because it matches their frequency. It matches where they're coming from spiritually at the time. And, this theology I'm giving you of omnism, it may not have a frequency. The idea of omnism is to try to have maximum frequency content, to be able to touch all spiritual frequencies. That's the essence of omnism, right? You want to be able to encompass every belief, every passion, and somehow resonate with it to the greatest extent you can, as long as it's not doing harm to other souls, stealing their freedoms, if you will. But omnism, because it has this wide frequency characteristic, can be one of the most disturbing belief systems, especially if you can embrace omnism as a Christian, and it might extend your frequency range somewhat, but maybe not to the extent that going full omnist with the complete set of beliefs and theology that I'm talking about. And that's why omnists don't really try to preach, don't try to convert people. It's not a matter of winning to an omnist. It's a matter of getting along, finding a way to coexist with other beliefs. And that coexistence can eventually, we hope, raise people's consciousness to be able to deal with this full range of spiritual frequencies, not to feel weirded out when you encounter something that's anti-resonant, out of your comfortable frequency range, etc. And to the extent that we can deal with those interactions, those frequency mismatches, phase mismatches, healthily, we can interact in a more loving and compassionate way with other souls, even if we don't quite understand them and we don't have the same beliefs or the same prejudices as they do. So from that standpoint, an omnist doesn't really dictate any particular prayers, any particular ritual. If you find something that works, go for it. Jokingly, in my book, I in the section on prayer, I put a couple of examples of prayers you can use when you're dealing with me as a soul. One of the prayers I gave suggestion to anybody dealing with me or had a problem with my book or my teachings, and I'll tell you here because you might find it useful, and you can even put it in the comments if you want, and I'll appreciate it. That prayer is "Fuck off, Rob." That's a prayer. You're telling me that you're not resonating with me. My message isn't hitting. It's disturbing you. It's unsettling you. And, if I hear that and I choose to act on it, I may disconnect a little bit. I may soften my message. Or I might just dig in deeper if I feel that's what you need, or if I feel that's the right choice for me to make, because that's my free will. And that's the nature of prayer, is everybody that gets involved in it has an input into what the result of the prayer is. And that's why some prayers get answered, you get what you want, and some prayers it's like, oh man, I prayed for this and I got the exact opposite, or I got 10 times worse. And this is the kind of thing that leads to the dissolution of faith. Makes us not believe in a higher power, especially if you're one of the people that thinks this higher power is a single God that should have all power and all this and all that, and If they're not listening to your prayer, you must either be a bad person or God doesn't love you. And either of which is like, well, why should I care about God either? And that's the source of a lot of the downside of these power religions. Most one religions are power religions. One God, cosmic oneness. And they can be very dystopian in that respect because if there's two poles of this, you either think that your God is all powerful and therefore will justify whatever you want to do, or you think that your ideology is absolute truth and you try to force it on everybody else, which is another way of unpleasantly exerting power and creating karma for yourself that you're going to have to work out in another life. Anyway, I think I've pretty much beat that topic to death. If I keep talking much longer, I'm going to spill the beans on something else I was going to say for a separate episode. So I think we'll wrap up this episode. Again, thanks for joining me. If you like what you're hearing, please comment, share, like, whatever. If you'd like to give any monetary assistance, I'm on PayPal, robtrump at yahoo.com. If you prefer Patreon, let me know, and I'll eventually get around to making a Patreon account. Again, as I'll say all the time, I'm not really doing this for money. I'm semi-retired, close to getting my Social Security, and perfectly happy living off of that somewhere in the world where I can afford to. I'm not, at this point, a very materialistic person. It'd be nice to have more money, to eat nicer meals, live in nicer places, go back to the U.S. to visit my family once in a while. But, these are all things that technology makes luxuries anymore. Who knows? They may be luxuries we may never be able to afford again after what's happening on the world stage right now. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you for another episode of the Omnist Hour. Take care.